What's going on, family? This is Scrapbook Boxing, Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series. Today I want to take a look at some colored titles. Men who wore the colored championship belt. We're going to examine 3 of these fighters. I'm going to do one video at a time. Now I'm going to continue with the Joe Gans series that I covered the other day. Through one of these fighters. One of the Joe Gans held the colored lightweight championship. And I will be covering him at a later video. But right here you're looking at one of the greatest middleweights of all time. One of the greatest middleweight champions of all time. I have this man ranked number 5 of the greatest middleweight champions of all times. And number 4 of the greatest middleweight of all times. This fighter's name is Harry Smith. A lot of people have never heard of Harry Smith. It's not talked about. And once you learn about Harry Smith, you're going to second guess some of the middleweights that you see around. Now Harry Smith, who they call the Harlem Thunderbolt, was born October 28, 1907 in Jamaica, British West Indies. He unfortunately died September 19, 1933 in Chicago, Illinois. He stood 6 foot tall and weighed 158 to 176 pounds. Harry Smith was managed by Dave Brown. Now Dave Brown had affiliations with Glub's Gym. Glub's Gym was located in Harlem on 116th Street. And in that gymnasium, you had some of the greatest fighters that ever lived come out of that gym. Fighters such as Dixie Kid, welterweight champion of the world. You had Danny Cox, who was a heavyweight. Kid Norfolk, phenomenal. I did a profile on Kid Norfolk. Type in Kid Norfolk, Scrapbook Boxing, and learn about Kid Norfolk. You can learn about Dixie Kid as well. You had Smitty, who was Ray Robinson, later Sugar Ray Robinson. He was 18 years old at the time. You had a fighter by the name of George Godfrey. Joe Sadler, who turned out to be Sandy Sadler. Jimmy Carter. These are just names that I'm throwing out there. But you had hundreds of fighters that came out of that gym. Now Harry Smith punched like a mule. He tore his way through the amateur ranks and began on March 4th, 1927 with a knockout over Tom Farrell. Tom Farrell was a very good fighter in Harlem at the time. Now this took place in January 1928 while competing in the finals of the 1928 Metropolitan Amateur Games. That was located in Madison Square Garden. Now at that time, Harry Smith was destroying all the fighters they had in front of him. He was 12-0 with 10 straight knockouts. Only 5 of them. In fact, none of them made it past the 5th round. Harry Smith didn't need to be a fighter. His fighter was a dentist. He was supposed to be a dentist. Then his father became a businessman and had real estate all over Harlem. They were very wealthy. But Harry Smith wanted to become a fighter. On March 4th, 1928, Harry Smith made his professional debut against a fighter by the name of Gene McHugh at the Olympic Club in Harlem, New York. That Olympic Club was like the Felt Forum in Madison Square Garden. They had the Felt Forum, where next to the actual main arena, where you had basketball and other events, they would hold the amateur tournaments at the Felt Forum. And then eventually they would have some small fights at the Felt Forum. Well, that was the Olympic Club in Harlem. Now, Harry Smith wound up becoming one of the trainers, and he would sit around the gyms with Norfolk and other old-time fighters as years went by. And Harry Smith was responsible for getting a few amateur fighters a job at the Harlem Opera House. And at the Harlem Opera House, you had a fighter by the name of Danny Cox, who was the doorman. Louis Valentine, who was one of the best amateur fighters in Harlem. Matter of fact, Louis Valentine will fight in the finals of the 1940 Golden Gloves against Sugar Ray Robinson. So Louis Valentine, Joe Sadler, and Smitty Ray Robinson, a lot of people don't know that. They all worked at the Harlem Opera House at a summer job that was provided by Harry Smith. Harry Smith had an amateur record of 60-0 with 55 straight knockouts. Speaking of Ray Robinson, Robinson had an amateur record of 85-0 with 60 knockouts. 40 in the very first round. So it just goes to show you, fighters at that time were completely different. The ethics were different. They were much stronger men at that time. You ask a fighter today to hand screw 100 screws into a piece of wood. But before he had to do that, he had to unscrew 500 screws out of a piece of wood. Or at the age of 13 or 14, he had to carry a huge block of ice up 4-story flight of steps. Because that was the job a lot of these guys had. So naturally they'll be stronger, the ethics will be different. They were very strong, hard-punching fighters at that time. And Harry Smith was the best amateur fighter in the country. Smith easily KO'd Gary Leach and the Black Spoiler, Homer Roberts. He was a former national amateur champion. This took place July 15, 1929. Not even Panama Joe Gans, Maxie Rosenblum, Jeff Smith, the Cuban Bobby Brown, another good fighter, Frank Moody, and many other great fighters were able to do this. But Harry Smith would knock this man out in one round. And after various fights that took place under the tutelage of Dave Brown for Harry Smith, he would finally get the big fight. Because at that time, the biggest name in Harlem was a fighter by the name of Jack McVeigh. Jack McVeigh was an African-American middleweight who had the colored championship. McVeigh was an idol in Harlem. They would meet on November 17, 1929. This would be at the Olympic AC in Harlem, New York. They packed the house, no air conditioning, but the crowd would never be disappointed. McVeigh took charge in the very opening round, and this would be the very first time that Harry Smith would be on the defensive. Because McVeigh had Harry Smith up against the ropes. He was nailing him with body shots and uppercuts. Smith went down several times, but eventually got up. And after 14 and a half rounds, Jack McVeigh began to wilt. Harry Smith gave it everything he had. And eventually his hand would be raised as the new middleweight champion of the world for the colored title. That was a brutal fight. And when Harry Smith was asked, what was going through your mind as you were being knocked down several times, he said, winners never quit and quitters never win. Harry would sign with Bronzeville veteran Powell Silvers. Now, Powell Silvers lived in Brooklyn, and he was a very, very, very good fighter during those days. They would fight at the famous Broadway Arena on January 7th, 1930. They both weighed 157 pounds. And Harry Smith punched Powell Silvers. Easy work for Harry Smith. Now, Harry Smith would fight greats such as Larry Gans, H. Hudson's, Maxie Rosenblum. Rosenblum would be light heavyweight champion at one point. And Leo Lomsky. These are all outstanding names. And he would face a Canadian light heavyweight champion by the name of Charlie Bangela on October 23rd, 1930. He would defeat him. He would face William Gorilla Jones, who would become middleweight champion of the world. He would receive a 10-round victory. He would face Joe Anderson, outstanding African-American fighter. He would knock him out in 3 rounds. October 2nd, 1931, Harry Smith, unbeaten streak, would be blemished. 56 straight victories and 47 knockouts against a fighter by the name of Jimmy Hammer. Jimmy Hammer knocked him down several times to the canvas. Towards the end of the 10th round, at the Dreamland Rink at San Francisco, California. Let's take a look at some of the fighters that Harry Smith would face. Now, what I'm actually showing you here is my Police Gazette scrapbook, All African American Fighters. It's over 1,000 pages. And you're not gonna see this anywhere. And I'm going to show you only 2 pages of this because I had mentioned to you this before. I'm having problems with some of the collectors, and they see this, they're gonna come knocking on my door again. But this is Harry Smith. Here's a colored championship belt. And here you have Harry Smith's record. He was born October 28, 1907 in the West Indies. 60 wins as an amateur. Losses, none. 1927 and 1928, he won a Metropolitan Amateur title, the Canadian Amateur title, and the City Amateur title. He would become the colored middleweight champion of the world. Started boxing professional March 1928. In 1929, he was placed on a card and he would face a fighter by the name of Willie Feldman, Detroit, Michigan. He would knock him out in 3 rounds. Eddie Prester, New York City, knock him out in 1 round. Gary Leach, Boston, Massachusetts, he would knock him out in 1 round. Homer Robinson, Boston, Massachusetts, knock him out in 7 rounds. Gene McHugh, New York City, knock him out in 5 rounds. And just take a look at all of the fighters that he knocked out. Fascinating. Jimmy Sullivan, Rockaway Beach, Long Island, knock him out in 3 rounds. all knockouts. He won on a foul against Henry Goldberg in New York City in 5 rounds. Other than that, he would win, but he would knock out a lot of his opponents. And you can see Jack McVeigh in New York City. He would defeat him in 15 rounds. And that's when he would capture the colored middleweight championship of the world. 1930, all knockouts and wins. January 7th, he would face Powell Silvers in New York. That would be in Brooklyn. Knock him out in 5 rounds. Charlie Ballinger, New York. Nobody could defeat him. He was the light heavyweight champion of Canada. March 24th. He would defeat him in 10 rounds. Fascinating fighter.